Hi everyone. Thank you so much for watching all my study session videos. I make them to help somebody that is studying for the MCAT. It's basically me teaching myself the material. I'm not a tutor, I'm not a professional MCAT prep person, just someone that didn't really have anybody to teach, so I decided to just teach myself via Zoom and hopefully it could help someone else. I do have a strong accent, so hopefully you guys can understand everything I'm saying. I do talk very slow, so please put these on 1.5 speed. I think it'll be so much better if you put it on 1.5 speed, but you don't have to. But I really hope you guys are enjoying these. Please like and subscribe if you are enjoying. So we're gonna get started. We have our structure of the nervous system. Basically, what that means is when we talk about the structure of the nervous system, we have our CNS and our PNS. So, CNS is going to be your central nervous system that is going to be composed of your brain and your spinal cord. Your periphery nervous system is your PNS, and that's going to be everything outside of your brain and your spinal cord. So basically, all the nerve that branch out from the brain and spinal cord. It's divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So when I say autonomic, we're talking about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic. So your fight or flight, your sympathetic, your parasympathetic is your rest and digest. And these to keep an eye on is your afferent and your efferent. So your afferent is going to be carrying information to your central nervous system, and your efferent is going to be carrying information away from the central nervous system, and it's going to be going to your muscle and your glands. So how I look at afferent is going to be afferent. I am arriving at the central nervous system while efferent, I am exiting the central nervous system. So afferent, A for at the nervous system, efferent, E for exit, leaving, exit, exiting the central nervous system. So typically, the function of the nervous system, basic things like motor, sensory, autonomic, such as reflexes. Higher is going to be your cognition, emotions, consciousness. So we have our motor units. So we have our lower motor neurons, and then we have our upper motor neurons. So let's first talk about the lower motor neurons. These are going to be the efferent neurons of the PNS. They control the skeletal muscle. So typically, if you have abnormality of the lower motor neurons, you're gonna have things like atrophy, which decrease in sizes of the skeletal muscle, involuntary twitches of the skeletal muscle, and hypotonia. So what that means, hypotonia. Hypo means decrease. Hyper means increase. So hypotonia is going to be decrease in tone and skeletal muscle, while hypoplasia it's in the name. Hypo means decrease. So decrease in muscle stress reflex. So when we talk about somo sensation, somoto sensation, I like how I say that. Somoto sensation, we have five main ones. It's going to be position, senses, vibration, touch, pain, and temperature. So mechanoreceptor is going to be your position, vibration, and touch. Neuroceptor, nociceptors is going to be your pain. Temperature is going to be your thermal receptors. So, um, I think pain is extremely important. All these are extremely important, but I remember just doing a practice question, and it was just like, okay, what type of receptor could be if assigned, if while look based on the passage, right? So you have to go back in the passage and figure out, okay, what is the scientist testing? So for example, if the scientist is testing, oh, the level of morphine, that each patient needs, then we know that we're looking at no nociceptors because pain is gonna be called nociceptors. So that's just one way that the MCAT could bring up the somotor sensation. So we're on muscle stress reflex. So reflex have two parts, your efferent, your stimuli, and your efferent, your response. So muscle stress reflex causes the muscle to contract after it's stressed, and it's basically a protective response. An example is your knee-jerk response, basically when the doctor puts a hammer in the tendons below the kneecap just to see your responses. And it's just a natural protective response. Gray and white matter. So when we talk about gray and white matter, it contains neuron somas, and gray matter is the side of information processing. And when we're talking about white matter, it contains myelinated axons, and that is the side of information transmission. Now we are up in the upper motor neurons. So the upper motor neurons, known as the UMN, controls the LMN. How I view this is the upper motor neuron. It is the manager of the LMN. So LMN is the employee. So we know that LMN control muscle of the limbs and trunk. And if it's bypassed to the cranial nerve, it controls muscle of the head and neck. So with the UMN, which is the upper motor neurons, if we have issue with this, we're gonna have things like hyperflexion, clonus, which is basically twitch. So hyperflexion, as we mentioned, hyper means increase, so increased flexion. Hypertonia, increased tone of skeletal muscle. Hyper means increase, hypo means decrease. And we're going to have things like extensor plantar response. Somatosensory tract, how I view that is like somatosensory tract is our deliver route, while the cortex is like your final destination. So somatosensory tract is basically gonna have two big categories. Your position sense, your vibration sense, and the fine touch is one category, and your pain temperature, your pain, your temperature, and your gross touch is another category. And how I view the track is basically it's a delivery route and it's basically where things cross over. So for your position sense and vibration sense and your fine touch, it's gonna cross over in the brainstem, while for your pain, temperature, and gross touch, it's gonna cross over at the level of the spinal cord. So somatosensory tract to me is just basically your delivery routes where things are gonna be crossing over. So, overview of the function of the cerebral cortex. You have things like your frontal lobe, which plays a big role on, I would say, analytical thinking, like thinking maturity. Um, Parietal lobe, somatosensory cortex, spatial manipulation. Occipital lobe plays a big role in the vision. Temporal cortex is sound. As you can see, we have things like Broca area and Monarchy area, which we're gonna talk about it down the line. But Monarchy area, how I view it is like a Wikipedia is basically language, understanding language, while Broca language production. Cerebrum, basically coordinate movement. Uh, that's basically what I think about cerebrum. Is basically has to do with movement. So brainstem connects all part of the brain together, including the cranial nerves. And one important thing is the reticular formation. This is extremely important. I've seen this before when taking practice exam. So it plays a big role in autonomic function and controlling things like the most important respiratory, digestion, and lower and higher function. So this is very important. Reticular formation. So respiratory is a big thing, plays a role in your autonomic function. Another important thing, well, let's talk about internal capsule. Basically, it contain many important pathways, including the corticospinal tract. But this is actually extremely important. Your corpus callosum. I feel like I've seen this a lot. Your corpus callosum. It connects the right and left central, not central, cerebral hemisphere, right? So when I think of corpus callosum, it's basically like a bridge that allows the right and the left hemisphere to talk. Okay, so think about you're in a road and that bridge connects you to another part of the road. And the one side of the road is your left and the other side is your right. So your corpus callosum is your bridge. And if certain things is wrong with this area, which I've seen before when it's come down to doing practice question, we're gonna have issues with communicating from the right and the left side of the hemisphere. Something to know about the left hemisphere, it plays a big role in language. So like you have things like left, how I view it is like left is for logic and language, so it plays a big role in language. So as I mentioned, the Ronaki area, language comprehension. So Wikipedia plays a big role in language comprehensions. Like when you go to Wikipedia, your main goal is to actually get more comprehension on the information you want. Even though in high school they were like, don't use Wikipedia, but language comprehension, that's how I remember it. And then you have your bright goal is going to be your speech production. But left hemisphere plays a big role in like logic and language. The right hemisphere, I was thinking about music, creativity. So how I view the right hemisphere, the way I remember it is like you always want to have the right idea when it comes down to music, when it comes down to being creative. So that is your corpus callosum. It's that bridge that helps connect your right and your left hemisphere. Your basal ganglia is very important. So every time I think about basal ganglia, I'm thinking about motor function, right? But also, what I think about is Parkinson disease, right? Um, Anything with Parkinson disease, I am thinking about the basal ganglia. Parkinson disease is basically a loss of dopamine producing neurons in the stemma nigra. So, an important fact about this is that it is called nigra is because these actually dopamine actually have like pigment where once it's working a lot, it produces a pigment that scientists could look to see like a black um it looks black. When scientists look at it, it actually looks black. Um so it produced like neuromelanin. And all humans have these. And that is where the name actually comes from. So your thalamus is basically sensory function because this is where all the senses actually go to. They travel to the thalamus, and the thalamus basically figure out where they go. So how I view the thalamus, I view it as a busy bus station, and your sensory are basically the bus, and the thalamus just help it get to the right path. Hypothalamus is very important. It's important to know all the hormones in the hypothalamus. So basically, it controls the pituitary gland, the master gland that control all other glands in the body. We have your glutamate. Glutamate is one of the most excitatory neurotransmitter. And how I remember this is like, let's just say you're exercising, right? Um, and you're doing glute exercise. So I always view it as like working out your glute. You have to get excited to work out your glute. Your reticular activating system is important for consciousness. GABA and glycine are the two inhibitories. GABA and glycine are just two common inhibitories of neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine plays a big role. Um, so acetylcholine in the nuclei and the frontal lobe release it to the cerebral cortex called the basalis and the septal nuclei. But acetylcholine plays major role in a lot of function in the body. So if you do, one example is that loss of acetylcholine um, could lead to well, there's a theory basically loss of acetylcholine could be one of the cause of Alzheimer's disease, but acetylcholine plays a lot of role in the body, like movement, memory, and heart rate. When it comes to histamine, the hypothalamus sends it. But basically, histamine are basically chemical messages that are released by mast cells. So if you have a allergic reaction, histamine is going to be released, and that's why you have things like antihistamine, like anti against histamine, to fight things like allergies. So when it comes down to norepinephrine, there's an area in the pons called the locus cerebralis that release it. So what I do know about norepinephrine, it plays a big role in normal alertness, completely different from epinephrine. Epinephrine, think of the EpiPen. So when you have an emergency, you have your EpiPen, right? And that is basically what you use, kind of like your plays a big role in flight or flight. And that is basically the main difference. So norepinephrine is basically normal alertness, while epinephrine is like if you have an emergency. I always think of an EpiPen, and I always think of fight or flight for that one. Um, that is what I have. Serotonin, the raphe nuclei is basically what release it, but serotonin plays a big role in mood. It's kind of like your feel good neurotransmitter. Your dopamine, VTA. So when it comes down to drugs, rewards, we're thinking about VTA, the Centra Nigra, as I mentioned, it's Nigra, it means black. So basically, these dopamine byproduct is like a black stain in the brain. So scientists will actually view a black spot. So substantia nigra, if I'm thinking about Parkinson disease, I'm gonna think dopamine and substantia nigra and basal ganglia. So you're gonna have lesion studies. So these are not done in humans. These are basically what is used to look at different region of the brain. You're gonna have removal, radio frequency lesion. Basically, they're used to destroy tissue on the surface of the brain and deep inside of the brain, just so they could look at the brain. You have neurochemical lesion, basically making those neurons extremely excitatory, where they just died and they just burned out. So you have things called oxydopamine, which destroy dopamine and norepinephrine neurons. This can model Parkinson disease. Cortical cooling plays a role in cooling the neurons until they stop firing. And then we have crop loop, which are surgically implanted between skull and the brain. And these are temporarily, which are different from what I mentioned before. These are not temporary. These are very, very important, extremely important. Like, these are so important. Like, knowing the scan, the EEG, the MEG. So, if we're looking at CT scan and MRI, things to know is that CT scan, they use X-ray and computer processing. So if you're looking at bleeding and tumor, while MRI, they make like 3D image of the structure. They're very details. Um, but like CT scan, MRI, EEG, basically all this is fair game, literally fair game. Know it very well. EEG, um, how I how I look at this is basically EEG. It's in the name. How I view it is E for electrical activity. So basically, looking at the electrical activity in the brain, and I actually did research on this. I did research using EEG. It could tell us about seizure, sleep stage, cognitive tasks. So when I was doing research at MCAT College, we were looking at how does our brain when we're doing cognitive tasks, and keyword for EEG will be electrical activity. That is our keyword. They basically put an electrode placed on your scalp just to look at the pattern. fMRI, keyword will always be blood. fMRI will always be blood. Um, so they will look not just at the structure, but they also will look at the activity. So CT and MRI will look at the structure only, but EEG, MEG, fMRI, PT scan will look at function and activity. So MEG, it's just basically better than EEG. I'm sorry, I skipped MEG. fMRI is so important. So important. I got that question wrong a lot. But basically, it looks at the structure, um, like which structure are active in the brain, and it's looking at blood flow. Sorry, I'm sick, but it's looking at blood flow, looking at which part of the brain is active in a particular time through blood flow. You could see blood flow. Blood is your keyword. Blood for EG, electrical activity is your keyword. Um, PET scan, it gives us detailed structure, but it combined them with CT scan and MRI. And the keyword is glucose. Inject glucose into the cell and see what areas of the brain are more active at a given point in time. And our brain does use glucose for energy. So keyword will always be glucose. Glucose, 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 glucose. EEG, electrical activities. MEG, just better than EEG. But it's more rare because it requires a large machine. So I haven't seen the MCAT ask about MEG, but EEG is electrical activity. MEG, better resolution than EEG, but same process, but it's just better. fMRI is always the keyword is always going to be blood. Keyword is blood. PET scan, keyword is glucose. Keyword is going to be glucose. So we're going to go over behavior and um, behavior and genetics. So temperament is basically personality that you're actually born with. It's basically everything that you just had when you were born with, while heredity is passing trait from parents and ancestors to offspring through genes. Personality is basically what you develop over unlike well unlike you know what I just mentioned. Personality is believed to be consistent over a person lifetime. Obviously, based on life, you could change your personality, but it is believed to be consistent over a person. Twin studies and adoption studies are very important. So when we're looking at monozygotic, it's basically identical, while dizygotic is basically fraternal twins. So monozygotic, the eggs are split into two after fertilization, and they share 100% of the gene. While dizygotic develop into two separate fertilized eggs, and they share 50% of the regular genes. So mono, just think of one, is going to split after fertilization, and dizygotic develop from two. So two separate fertilized eggs. And it's going to be 50% of the gene. So identical twins shares 100% of the gene, while dizygotic share 50% of the genes. When we talk about nature and nurture, nature is always going to be talking about the genetic components, while nurture is going to be talking about the environmental components. So, for example, if we were looking at schizophrenia, which is caused by genes, we could expect to see different rates of it. But monozygotic, they will 100% have that gene. Dizygotic will have 50% of that genes. But environment could play a different set of if that gene, is gonna be transferred. It's gonna be or nurture. So for example, if we have a twins that doesn't smoke marijuana, goes off to college, one twins goes to college to University of Miami, while the other twins is at University of Florida. One of them is smoking marijuana. Well, the nurture side will trigger, even though one twins may not have that schizophrenia being diagnosed, but nurture, while the other twins that is smoking marijuana could have schizophrenia, and we could definitely say, well, it's a nurture, it's an environment component that caused the twins to have schizophrenia. So adoptive study is basically looking at twins to see how would they react if, you know, how would they react if we have a biological family and an adopted children that goes to a adopted family, while how would their personality be? So if we were to look at this, right, if the individual is more related to the biological parents and they're adopted, then we know that's a genetic. That's going to be your nature, genetics component. But if you look at these like adopted siblings, right, and they are more related to their adoptive parents, then we know that's nurture. That's the environment component. Here, heritability is basically looking at traits that are passed down through genes. And as I mentioned, gene environment and influence. So as we mentioned again, nurture versus nurture is basically looking at nature, which is the gene, nurture, which is the environment. So let's just say, as mentioned for the example, we have an attractive baby, one is cute, one is ugly. One of the baby gets more attention, while the other baby does not get more attention, right? So one of the baby have two both babies have the gene for depression, but the beautiful baby gene is not active, while the ugly baby gene makes all the protein and has all his life difficult because he's suffering from depression. So our gene is our nature component, while nurture is going to be the environment, right? So the baby gene is not active, the beautiful baby gene is not active, while the ugly baby gene is active. Because the nurture, the environment, this the you know, trigger that, which allow it to have, depression. We could look at phenylketonuria. So basically, it's a gene that encodes a liver enzyme phenylalanine. As we know, amino acid is so important for the MCAT. Phenylalanine is a nonpolar amino acid. So we have a phenylalanine hydroxylase, but because the enzyme is missing, amino acid phenylalanine doesn't get converted to tyrosine. So now we have a buildup of phenylalanine that is causing brain problems. And how do we solve this, right? So infant will get screened, they're going to be placed on the free diet, and most will grow without a problem, right? That's our nature component. Placed at a free diet, most grow without a problem, or nature or nurture, I'm sorry, a nurture component is the environment. So the free diet, phenylalanine diet is our nurture. And then our nature is our genetic factor, which is going to be the enzyme, the mutation of that gene. So we talked about the central dogma, basically Watson and Crick. I actually have a professor that was actually friends with Watson and Crick. Um, and I did research for her, Dr. Ketfirst. Shout out to Dr. Ketfirst from Florida A&M University. Thank you so much. If you ever watch this video, thank you so much for everything you have done for me. So we have DNA, RNA to mRNA. That's basically the central dogma. And you do know transcription, DNA to RNA transcription, RNA to protein is translation. That's what the central dogma is basically talking about. And it's talking about epigenetics. It's basically saying that our gene could change, and it could be due to our environment, such as stress. If we're in an area that has high pollution, that could impact our gene. If we're in an area that has high stress, that could change our gene expression. That is basically what epigenetic is saying, is that our environment could be a factor to changes in our genes, and that could result in diseases. Homostasis means that we always want our body to be out of balance. Ectonology. I'm pretty sure I'm saying it wrong, but it's basically focused on animal behavior. Call these overt behavior, basically what you can observe. So we have things like innate behavior track. These are things you're born with. And throughout life, we have these behaviors that help us shape who we are. And we have these behaviors from ancestors to ancestors through ancestors from evolution that helps us survive. So innate behaviors are that. They're innate behavior traits. So you have inherited, so you innate these behaviors through DNA. You have intrinsic, they're presented without, even if you're raised in isolation. Pooing, peeing, sleeping. Stereotypic, we have they're performed the same way each time, and inflexible. These does not modify. You're always going to be pooing. There's no modification to that. Unless you have diarrhea, but yeah. Um, so these are fully developed right away and at first performance. There's no influence by experience. It's something that you literally do. That's going to be your consummate fully develop right away at first performance. So think about a woman that is going through pregnancy and the patient has nausea, basically just a way of your body to avoid toxic food during an important period of development. Now we have learned behaviors. These behaviors are what you learn. There are non-inherited, so you have to learn, you have to get these through experience. You have it intrinsic, which means absent when animals are raised in isolation. So imagine there was this science, there was this woman, right? And people did research on this woman. Her parents isolated her from the world. I forgot her name, but yeah, these are going to be absent when animals are raised in isolation. So social skills are going to be off, right? If you're isolated from the world, they're changeable. they're adaptable and progressive, right? Improve or refine practice over time. So we see an insect that could fly, right? It start off as an innate, right? But throughout time, it becomes more affection. It becomes much better. That is all for this video. I'll be talking about motivation and attitude. I'll be uploading that video soon. Thank you so much for watching, and it was a pleasure.